GM built a Corvette so extreme that selling it would have created problems they didn't want to deal with. Not with competitors, not with the press. Problems inside General Motors itself. Because once this Corvette left GM's control, there would be no way to explain it, contain it, or pretend it never happened. So instead of advertising it, instead of celebrating it, GM quietly locked it away, redirected the evidence, and let the story fade. For decades, most people didn't even know these Corvettes existed, plural, and that wasn't an accident. When people talk about forbidden muscle cars, they usually point to cars that were controversial loudly, cars that made headlines, cars that embarrassed rivals, cars that were eventually documented, cataloged, and accepted. This Corvette story is different. There was no announcement, no press leak, no heroic failure, just silence. And silence inside a company like GM usually means one thing. Something worked, but went further than they were comfortable admitting. By the late 1960s, General Motors was fighting two battles at once. Externally, they were competing with Ford and Chrysler for performance credibility. Internally, they were fighting themselves. Corporate horsepower limits were in place, brand hierarchies mattered, legal departments were becoming increasingly powerful. GM engineers, meanwhile, were not slowing down. They understood that outright horsepower was only part of the equation. The real gains were coming from weight reduction and balance. Nowhere was that more tempting or more dangerous than the Corvette. The Corvette wasn't just a car, it was GM's image. And image mattered. Horsepower numbers make headlines. Weight changes outcomes. GM engineers knew that removing mass changed everything. Acceleration, braking, cornering, and how forgiving a car was at the limit. Aluminum wasn't a novelty. It was a weapon. GM had already proven aluminum big blocks could work in experimental and racing programs. They were lighter, they responded faster, and they fundamentally altered how a car behaved. Installing one in a Corvette was the logical next step. It was also the moment when logic started to clash with policy. Once the aluminum big block found its way into Corvette test cars, GM realized what they had created. This wasn't just a faster Corvette. It was a Corvette that disrupted GM's internal performance hierarchy, threatened warranty exposure, and created a paper trail GM just didn't want. Selling it publicly would mean acknowledging that GM had built something they couldn't fully control, and that made people uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. GM didn't cancel the program publicly. They simply just let it disappear. Engineering focus shifted, engines were reassigned, anything that pointed back to the Corvette experiment quietly stopped moving forward. No press release, no explanation, just absence. On paper, it looked clean. In reality, it wasn't, because not everything disappeared. Years later, collectors began noticing something strange. A Corvette surface that didn't line up with any production records. Not a show car, not a prototype displayed for publicity. A real car. Its construction details raised questions. Its components didn't match brochures. And its existence suggested that at least one aluminum engine Corvette had slipped through. Debate followed, documentation was thin, and GM said nothing, which only made the story more interesting. Then, something happened that made it impossible to dismiss as a one-off. A second Corvette surfaced. This one wasn't a coupe, it was a convertible, and that detail mattered, because building two different body styles meant this wasn't an accident. It meant the experiment went further than GM ever admitted. Two cars, two configurations, both surviving. That's not a rumor. That's a pattern. At this point, GM had options. They could deny it, they could explain it, they could correct the record, They chose silence, because acknowledging these Corvettes would mean admitting that the experiment was real. It wasn't isolated, and control was lost. Silence was safer, and decades later, it still is. These Corvettes aren't important because they were sold. They're important because they survived. They represent a moment when engineering ambition outran corporate comfort, and GM chose to step back rather than explain itself. Two cars exist today that were never meant to exist at all, and that's why this story still unsettles people. The most dangerous muscle cars weren't the ones proudly displayed in showrooms. They were the ones the factory hoped would disappear quietly. In this case, they didn't. Two Corvettes survived, one coupe, one convertible, and the fact that we're still arguing about them tells you everything you need to know. If you're interested in the muscle cars that escaped corporate control, you're in the right place. Subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.